Hey class. Um, so this module is really just about looking forward to the future, kind of reflecting on what we've learned and where we go from here, and particularly thinking about charity, which I think, well, we'll talk about it. And there's some supplemental lectures that you'll watch in the module as well. So in the book, they kind of give us this, this optimistic, I think, this understanding that grassroots stuff works. Working from the grassroots means getting a lot of community buy-in and letting it be something that is meaningful and significant for the community members. And when we talk about health equity, and I really want to emphasize that we're looking at for health equity, and there's this really common model in public health and global health that says there's three kind of elements of health equity. One is for policies, so to have health policies that are directed towards equity, to understand what creates health, and so meaning that, remember that broad vision of what all health encompasses, that social, mental, and physical state of well-being, and thirdly, the capacity of communities to be autonomous, to have their own health resources and their ability to maintain their own health. So the example in the book that they give is like this, is about HIV/AIDS, right? This idea that the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, ACT UP, shows really in a clear, it's very evident that through the different phases, we see that the movement of people, right? We have the retrovirus that came down from $8,000 a year to $6,400 a year per patient, and then other similar campaigns for access and for treatment, like in South Africa, the pressure to get PrEPFAR going with President Bush, and really, I think what the authors are trying to do, you can tell that it's aimed towards like a student audience, right? Because they're saying, look, this is students and these are people and they're galvanized, and what they do is that they get information, right? A young and informed public getting the right information, and then using, of course, nonviolent demonstration and using their voice as a collective group to create social change. So they talked some about and they talked a little bit in the chapter about what it takes to create social change, right? You have to have knowledge. I don't know if I put it in the slides or not, but you have to have knowledge. You have to have people who are ready to act. And a lot of sociologists, for example, say that there also has to be kind of like a crisis point, like some sort of movement that pushes people over the edge, and that's how we create social change. And there's different models on how that happens, but and they give you like this toolkit of what activists needs, and engaging with ourselves first, looking at me, what is my role and what is my potential impact, and looking at it both at a micro and a macro level, because every single person does matter, and what we do and how we act and how we discuss things absolutely matters. Finding good partners. So thinking that we're going to go and do it alone isn't going to work. Knowing the issues, studying things, and for me as an anthropologist, this is really important, and I hope that you will continue to perform mental exercises where, we all will have our opinions, and those are formed based off of our exposure to media, friends, family, education, of course, but to always expand that. We tend to surround ourselves with people who agree with us, especially on social media. And I'm not saying you should get your information from social media. In fact, I'd say go beyond that, right? So go beyond that, and we need to be getting information if there's something that you don't agree with, if there's a political campaign or a public issue that you're like, oh, I feel this way. That's great. You don't have to change the way you feel, but you need to understand the other side, I think, right? Knowing issues from all sides as best as we can to really be able to understand it. Dialoguing with policymakers. Yes, political action is important. I spent many years in Washington, D.C. advocating for, doing political advocacy and lobbying for graduate and professional student issues. But there are a lot of different reasons, right? And to be involved with your policymakers, with your elected officials, both at a local level, state level, and yeah, in Washington, D.C. too. When you do that, what you want to do is make sure that you're focusing on key issues. We don't want to lose sight of the big picture. So what are the main issues? And so articulating, if you're ready to do political lobbying or legislative action work, you want to make sure that you work with your partners, work with your allies and other activists to highlight those key issues really well, have some good talking points, and then maybe organize a public demonstration. Or of course, we're using nonviolent techniques and strategies, but to help drive public awareness, build a coalition, meaning work together with other NGOs and other groups and clubs or whatever, and be the change. You need to be willing to do what you're asking other people to do. I think that's really important. And so, so these are all things that we want to think about when we go towards the future. And so I'll give you three things to watch. One is a TED Talk, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But first I want to talk about these two different philosophies of perspectives on charity, really. And one is from Slavoj Žižek, and he's Slovenian, really cool accent, right? So watch his if you haven't already. Super interesting philosophy where he goes into cultural capitalism, and he talks about essentially we're always kind of on this spectrum, these dueling perspectives inside our conscience that tell us, well, I want to consume, but I have to be anti-consumption at the same time. So he says, we've built in. If you look at models, he gives examples of Starbucks and Tom's shoes, but there are other examples that you could think of. Do we have this ethical duty? We feel like we do as consumers to be like responsible consumers, like, oh, I'm buying the Starbucks coffee, but when I buy the Starbucks coffee, I'm actually buying into this whole model of like fair trade, protecting the environment, etc. Right? So, and he says that's really important, that in fact, you're not just buying the coffee, you're buying that whole model. And through this, his kind of upshot is, he says, look, charity degrades and demoralizes. Why? Because it allows us, it's sort of like a falsity, right? It allows us, I don't want to watch his explanation of it, which is much better than mine, but, in this way that the poverty is still there, the poverty still exists, but it's enabled us to feel good about our lifestyle because they've sold us the belief that we needed to know what we wanted to feel like we're being morally good. So anyway, so he's on one end of the spectrum, and that's his upshot. He says charity degrades and demoralizes. So it's bad. And so the question is, what would he say then we should do for things like, global health and to end poverty? Well, he'd say you need to make serious structural, institutional, government level policy changes. Okay. And then we have another great little short video lecture from Ananya Roy. And also, both of these people have really cool accents, right? And so she starts out talking about invisible workers, the idea of charity and this micro-philanthropy and ethical consumerism. She said, this is actually really, really probably good. That's the best way for us as consumers to use our dollar as our voice. Through our purchasing decisions. And she talks about poverty as the violence of disempowerment. And I really like that quote because it's so true. Like people who are trapped in poverty, it is a violence, right? The lives that they live, because they're completely disempowered. But we do have power. And so that's the argument she makes. She says, look, you can, with your dollar, you can choose, right? We can choose how we're going to spend our money, and you can spend more. For example, you can spend more and buy, the organic apples, I think was one of the examples she gives, or you can click to donate to a special to a cause, round up my build to donate to a cause, those things of micro philanthropy. And she says actually that by doing that and by buying from companies that are allowing us to be ethically accountable and ethical consumers, that we have that desired impact. So overall, this is all, and then there's the TED Talk, right? The TED Talk, and he says, he makes a lot of really good points, but one of the main points he makes is that we think incorrectly about charity. We think of NGOs, we make them nonprofits. We don't want nonprofits making a profit. But he says, but you've got to scale up. And you need to think about the fact that if we want people to make money, that we want them to make money for these good causes. He argues, for example, if we want the best minds working in innovation and charity, then, we have to be able to pay directors of NGOs comparable salaries to what they would make in the private sector. Why could we ask them to sacrifice, earning $400,000 a year in the private sector to come to manage an NGO where they'd be, make on average like $83,000 a year, for example. He gives some other examples too, and he says, why don't we allow NGOs to run like businesses? It's an interesting, I think it's an interesting thought exercise and an interesting thing to consider, what impact that would have. But my question to you guys, and this is something I want to think about, is in what ways do Roy and Zizek criticize the foundations and basis of charity? What is the basis of their criticism? And can we find examples that would support it or not? And really, at the end of the day, we're wrapping up this course. What do you feel? How do you think it will play out? Each person has to make their own decision, but of course that idea of being informed, thinking through things, thinking critically about things. And when I say that, I mean thinking through it from all different perspectives is really important.